Hi everyone, Matt here from Proof Fly Fishing. Welcome back. In today's video we're going to go over a couple things. We're going to start by talking briefly about different epoxies and finishes that are available, and then we're going to move on and we're going to epoxy on our grip that we fit last time, as well as the stint that we cut and fit in the last video. And then the last thing we're going to do today is we're going to glue on the tip top and talk a little bit about guide spacing to prepare for next time when we're going to actually start wrapping guides. So the first thing, there are a lot of different products on the market, and if you're just getting started it can be kind of overwhelming to know exactly what finishes and epoxies you need in order to complete the build. So I'm going to go over some of the most common products. The first is going to be Threadmaster. Threadmaster is applied to the thread wraps once you're done wrapping the guides on, and it seals and protects them. It comes in two parts, so you have to mix equal parts. You require syringes to mix them, and then you apply it generally while the rod is rotating. This comes in a light and a regular finish. Next up, and what we're going to use in this build is spar varnish. This is a marine varnish. It has a high oil content, which gives it a degree of flexibility. It's very easy to apply. There's no mixing. If you want, you can thin it a little bit, and we'll talk about that later. But it goes on ultra thin, and it gives kind of a nice vintage look to the wraps. It has a slight amber hue, as you can kind of see from the bottle here. Very easy to work with and very inexpensive. Some other considerations are going to be color preserver. Now, regardless if you're using nylon thread or silk, what's going to happen when you apply any thread finish to that thread is it's going to go translucent, which means you'll be able to see the blank and the guide foot underneath it. Now, sometimes you might want that effect, but if you want a solid wrap, then there's a couple different options. One would be to use a colored lock thread, which has color preserver already in it. My choice is to use a brushed on color preserver. That way you're not purchasing two spools of thread. You can get the same effect with only one spool of thread and a little bit of extra effort. So if you're using nylon, you're going to use a color preserver that's specifically designed for nylon, like this one. And if you're using silk, then I recommend Ailes, Premium Cane CP or color preserver. It's the best out there. I've used a lot of them, and for silk, this is really the only one that I've had consistent results with. So enough about those finishes. We're going to get into those a little bit more once our guides are wrapped and we start talking about how to seal them. So let's move on to epoxying on the grip. You remember in our last video we fit the grip, so we reamed it out and we got it down to the point where that grip comes just to the bottom of the grip, just like that. And now what we want to do is apply some epoxy to it. So the first thing we want to do is mark our blank. We don't want epoxy all over the place. We only want it under the grip. So what I like to do is kind of set the blank on the table and hold my grip next to it. And then right at the top of that grip, I put a piece of tape. Now that tape represents the far end of the top of that grip. So when I'm applying epoxy, I actually want to stay a little bit away from that tape because I don't want epoxy kind of showing up through the front of that grip. So we're going to apply a thin coat of epoxy over the whole thing here. And then from last time we also have our stint, which is going to go in the back of the grip. We're going to apply epoxy to that as well. And then we'll be all set when it's time to install our reel seat. But first thing, let's mix up our epoxy. Now, there are a lot of different epoxies on the market, and some people recommend using epoxy from, say, Home Depot, and that works fine. The 5-minute, the 30-minute, whatever you want to use will work fine. But what I recommend in this case is using a rod building epoxy. The difference is that this is a paste, and it's a lot easier to control. It's a lot easier to have a nice clean build when you're using a paste because it's not going to flow all over the place. So we want to do equal parts. I usually use two pieces of a popsicle stick. And you don't need a tremendous amount. I'd go for maybe, I don't know, roughly half a teaspoon of the first part. And also with the second part. Now come as close as you can to getting equal proportions. This stuff is not overly finicky, but the closer you can get, the better. And if you notice, this stuff is nice and thick. It's not going to run all over the place. So once we get those two elements in there, set that aside. And I'm just going to mix this up for about 30 seconds. This is a fast-acting epoxy, so I have roughly 5 minutes of working time. So it's important to have all your pieces kind of laid out in advance, so that when it comes time to apply the epoxy, you're not kind of scrambling for the pieces you need while that epoxy is starting to set up on you. So we're just going to kind of mix it up. You don't have to be too specific here. You don't have to worry about air bubbles or anything like that. Just get a good mix. Again, about 30 seconds is about what I aim for. And we're about there. Grab a little bit on the end of that stick. You can see how thick this stuff is. It just kind of clings to it. I give myself about 1/4 inch below the tape, and I start gently putting on a thin layer of epoxy all the way around the blank. Now one thing, if you remember, when we reamed out that grip, we left it tighter on the top than we did on the back. So a good portion of the epoxy that we're putting on the front of the grip here, or excuse me, to the forward part of the grip, is going to get pushed back when we go to insert that grip. So keep that in mind. You don't need to go quite as heavy on the back of the grip as you might otherwise do. I'm going to remove that stint a second. And so as we come to the bottom, go all the way to the end. A nice, thin, even layer all the way around. When you have that, go ahead and grab your grip. Remove that tape, because we don't want to have that get in the way. And then just slide that down. You probably can't see in the video here, but I'm getting just a tiny amount of epoxy that's coming out the bottom of that grip. Nothing to worry about. Just take a piece of paper towel and wipe that off. Just like that. Now since our epoxy is still good, what we're going to do is move on to installing the stint. The stint's going to go on the same way. So we're going to apply not a lot, just a little bit of epoxy, because this is pre-fit. You remember, we got a decent fit on it. Make sure you get the spaces between the tape dams, kind of fill those level to the dams that are around them. I can start to feel this epoxy setting up a little bit already, so again, we want to have everything ready to go, so when it's time, we can just put it together quickly. So there, a nice light to medium coat, and we're going to insert that in. I'm getting a little push out here, and that's okay. Once we come to that last tape, we're going to grab our paper towel again, and we're just going to clean off any excess. Nice thing about using a pre-made grip is, at least mine come with this plastic wrap on them, so you don't have to worry too much about getting epoxy on that grip. You just kind of do your best to wipe it off and get a nice clean surface. A little bit further. Just like that. One thing you want to watch out for, and I can see this happening a little bit in this stint, is that epoxy is kind of pushing it out. So hold it in place. You can hold that in place for just a few minutes while that epoxy starts to harden, and once it gets set up, even partially set up, nothing's going to move. So there we go. That's gluing a grip on. Pretty straightforward. The biggest mistake most people make is putting way too much epoxy on, and the worst thing that's going to happen is just going to get a whole bunch of it kind of, coming out the back end. But just, wipe that off and kind of clean as you go. Try to keep things as neat as possible. And again, make sure you kind of hold everything in place until that epoxy starts to set up. That's one nice thing about using the quick set epoxy too. You don't have to hold it all day. Okay, moving forward, let's talk a little bit about guide spacing. There are a lot of different ways to space guides, and there's a long history that different rod builders have used, different techniques and mathematical formulas they use to determine guide spacing. I'm going to include at the bottom, you'll see a link to a website that has a guide spacing calculator. It's pretty much all I use these days. It's a wonderful formula. You plug in the feet, the inches, the line weight, and it will generate the guide spacing for you based on some proven numbers. But the first thing we want to do before we get to guide spacing is install our tip top. Now, the reason I mentioned guide spacing first of all is because before we install our tip top, we want to measure down to our first guide. And the reason for that is, and there's some debate as to whether how important this is, but we went from the top of the blank, not necessarily the top of the installed tip top. The tip top is going to add, maybe a 1/4 inch to the length of the blank, maybe a little less. But for accuracy's sake, we want to measure down from the blank. So in this case, our first guide is 4.5 inches. So I'm going to hold my tape right up to that tip, measure down to 4.5 inches. Then I'm going to use a piece of this guide tape. It's a very narrow tape that's silicone free. That works great for holding your guides in place. And I'm just going to mark that guide location just like that. I try to center the tape over the measurement. So if it's 4.5 inches, that 4.5 is going to be located in the center of this tape. So once we have that measurement, we're going to go ahead and install our tip top. Now, if your epoxy is still good, if it's soft enough to still work with, you can just take some of that and apply it to the top of that blank. Very light amount. If it has set up, then you can use super glue. Super glue works great, and just dab a little bit on the upper 1/4 inch of the blank. Don't try to insert it into the tip top. It's too small and it just gets messy that way. But once you have that on there, take your tip top, slide it all the way down until it fully seats. It doesn't really matter which direction of the blank it goes on. There's a lot of talk these days, and there's a lot of controversy. You can look it up other videos too if you want to learn more about this, about which side of the blank to wrap the guides on. There's a lot of talk about finding the spline of the blank, which is a natural kind of relaxed state of the blank. Personally, I'm of the school that it just doesn't make that big a difference. If you wrap your guides on the straightest axis, when you kind of assemble your blank and sight it down, just like you're looking through a scope of a rifle, you find the straightest axis and you build on that axis. Finding the spline is something that is, I think it's helpful. It's in my mind a little bit dated, because where it's beneficial is if you're fishing a 2-piece rod or a 1-piece rod that's longer, then you can find the spline. But to find a spline on these shorter sections, like this butt section, you can't get enough bend in it because it's too short. So the multi-piece rods, 3 or above, I find it's just extremely difficult, if not impossible, to really locate the spline. You might be able to find it on a tip top, the upper section of your blank, but for the rest of the sections, unless you're fishing building a 2-piece rod, I just don't bother. But again, there's a little controversy there. If you're interested, you can find some other videos or some other discussions online. Well, that's pretty much it for today. We've got our first guide spaced, And next time what we're going to do is install, we're going to learn how to wrap a guide. We're going to wrap our first guide, and we're going to learn how to align guides with each other. And that's one of the reasons we installed the tip top first, because I like to use that tip top as kind of our definitive guide for all the other guides. We're going to sight all the guides down in accordance with that tip top. So I look forward to seeing you next time. We're going to wrap guides and talk about guide spacing a little bit more, as well as alignment. All right, thanks. We'll see you next time.